Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's episode of the 706 podcast, where we discuss, interrogate, explore the movie landscape to decide upon the 706 greatest films ever created. We are well on our way. Maybe 13% of our canon is full, maybe not even that many, but we are very happy that you're joining us on this journey. And today we're discussing a film that hasn't come out yet. It's called Killers of the Flower Moon. We're discussing the first trailer, and we're going to decide whether or not the film deserves to be inducted into the canon based on the trailer. And I will introduce my three co-hosts, and if you want to just say how many years you would give from your future to Martin Scorsese so that he can keep directing, because he's slowing down. He says he doesn't have enough time. So, Tony.
Hello, this is Tony. First of all, yes, Killers of the Flower Moon hasn't come out yet, but it is one of the 706 greatest movies of all time. And I'll give him 10 years. I'll shave off 10.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair. So he can make Kings of Comedy 2. Connor.
Thank you, Kirk. This is a tricky one. First of all, is there actually a trailer for Killers of the Flower Moon?
Oh, you have been in Germany for too long.
Can we stop and just okay, you guys will see.
It's a teaser. It's a 2-minute teaser.
How's that not a trailer?
That's more than a tease. I mean, if it's 2 minutes,
it's labeled a teaser. It's labeled,
but for Marty's standards, that's only a tease. Yeah, 2 minutes.
Who decides if it's a teaser or trailer? Like, is there like a guy?
The teaser is before the trailer, but anyway.
Okay.
Trailer's more official, but anyway. Yeah, I'm gonna give him my 70s and 80s. He can have them. I'm not using them.
All right, fair enough. And Anthony, go ahead, Anthony.
Anthony, and come on, guys, it's actually, he needs to give me years for some of the stuff I've had to watch through. So, I'm giving him nothing.
Oh, classic Anthony response. Also, I since I'm the host, I feel I have the authority to say that modern trailers are far too revealing. So, I mean, what was once a trailer is now a teaser, and what's now a trailer is basically like a fucking synopsis YouTube essay on the whole plot. Anyways, that is neither here nor there. We are here to discuss 2012's Looper. Interesting choice. Well, if I do say so myself, I was the one who nominated it, but I believe Connor formally chose it. And Looper is, kind of an interesting film. I would say science fiction, firmly rooted in some, it's it's a time travel film. I don't know how you would describe it, what like the specific esoteric genre you would describe. It's kind of a, action sci-fi thriller type of a scenario, and it centers around one Joe, who's played by Joseph Gordon-Levitt. And Joseph Gordon-Levitt is a looper. Essentially, time travel has not been invented, and this is the year 2044. But he is an assassin or a hitman for people who are sent back from the future 30 years in 2074 to essentially tie up loose ends. And things unravel. The plot thickens when he is sent back himself. His future self, played by Bruce Willis, is sent back, and he's tasked with killing him, and he doesn't, and the plot unfolds from there. But I have a lot of strong opinions on this film. I first saw it, probably once it was distributed to Blu-ray, and I didn't see it in theaters, but I remember just coming away from it feeling really, really kind of confused and frustrated, right? Because time travel in and of itself is a very mind-bending kind of exercise to explore, and it can, for somebody who really likes to understand the nuances of the plot and what's actually going on in the world, how the world is constructed, the mechanics of the world, it can be very disorienting, I to say the least. And I feel like consequently, I wasn't alone in that initial impression. And I feel like this film, though it did do well internationally. It didn't even gross its budget domestically, but it was a moneymaker. But I think it flew under the radar because it is so kind of obtuse, and it's very, I would say, bold. I would use the word bold to describe this movie more than any other descriptor. But directed by Rian Johnson of Knives Out, Glass Onion. What is he? Star Wars Episode 8. Is that what is that one?
Last Jedi.
Last Jedi. Last Jedi. I know people have strong feelings about that film. But yeah, we can talk about this film. This was I believe Ryan's kind of like first foray into kind of blockbuster cinema, major motion picture, and its attending budget, and some A-list actors. We have Emily Blunt in here as well, Jeff Daniels, Paul Dano, though he's only in it for maybe 20 minutes. So yeah, I've rambled enough. Let's pass it off to my co-hosts, and I'm curious. I can't remember. Has anybody not seen this film? Was this a first viewing for anybody? No. Okay. So yeah, let's just go ahead then, and we'll start it off with Tony. We'll start off with Tony. Tony always has some great opinions. Tony, tell us what you thought of Looper on this watch, and also tell us what Loop this was for you. Was this your second viewing, or third, or and how it compared and contrasts to your previous viewings?
Yeah, I think I had the same experience as you. I didn't see it in theaters, but I saw it on Blu-ray. I remember distinctly watching it with my brother and my dad in like 2013, like right after it had come out on Blu-ray. So like 10 years ago now. But I have not watched it or really thought about it since. And I think at the time I was kind of like, oh, it was pretty good. And yeah, it's an interesting one because like, yeah, I think it's sort of, I almost hesitate to say it flew under the radar because I distinctly remember when it came out that it was, and I mentioned this last time when you brought it up, that it was like pretty well reviewed. I feel like when it was out, like people were like talking about it, like at least in my like kind of film circles. And I think Rian Johnson at the time was like very revered, very esteemed. He had done Brick and he had done The Brothers Bloom. And he directed, I think, one episode of Breaking Bad. If you've seen Breaking Bad, you remember probably the Fly episode. So he was kind of like a cool young filmmaker, and this was kind of his opportunity to play on kind of a bigger stage with a bigger toolbox. And I think it's mostly like pretty successful. I think it mostly holds up. I like its depiction of kind of a cyberpunk future. Like there's parts of this movie that feel very like Blade Runner, and it's dirty, grimy. I mean, it's not as visually opulent, of course, as Blade Runner, but it's got that very kind of dingy near future kind of cyberpunk aesthetic, focusing on kind of the seedier parts of society where he's going into these kind of he's hanging out at a brothel. And I think that stuff is like pretty cool, and I think holds up pretty well. It's always interesting to see movies from the past and how they depict the future, and like the aesthetics of the world feel close enough to our own world that it feels very like plausible. I think that aesthetically in general, the movie is a success. I think it's very well edited. There's a number of great little montages. I saw Brick a long time ago, but I think that you see a clear evolution over those first three movies in terms of his competence with like action filmmaking and editing. I think that montage when you're seeing the timeline where Bruce Willis, lives basically, and Joseph Gordon-Levitt, basically the timeline where Joseph Gordon-Levitt does not kill Bruce Willis, his future self, and we see him grow into Bruce Willis. That's just like a really cool sequence. Although it is a little bit goofy when it cuts to Joseph Gordon-Levitt and it's all of a sudden he's Bruce Willis with the weird cyberpunk haircut. And it's a little bit like, all right, I'm not sure I buy it. And the facial makeup to make him look more like Bruce Willis, I think is just, it's not very effective at that. And it's just kind of an unnecessary distraction. And I didn't look this up beforehand, but I'm really curious to know when he wrote the screenplay or if he said, because the vibe I really get from this movie is that he wrote this when he was like 20. Like this really feels like a movie he wrote when he was like in like college or high school and like refined it maybe.
In 2002. I think I saw an Amazon like fact or something.
Oh, he wrote it in 2002.
Having ideas about it since 2002, which I don't know how old he would have been. He graduated from
He'd be like 30 because he's like early 70s, I think.
Really? Is that
Yeah, I think he was born in like 70. I mean, like, we could look this
okay?
up. He's
I
born in
thought you
like
were saying Rian
72.
Johnson is in his early 70s. I'm like, he's definitely.
He's 40. He's excuse me. He's 50. Well, he will be 50 this year. And yeah,
So
it's I
73.
saw something that he had a 3-pager for this film about a decade out. So he would have been just under 30. Yeah, when he kind of formulated this idea.
It makes sense to me because the reason I say that is because it's like Inception. Famously, Nolan had the script, well before he had the opportunity to make the movie. It was basically like, this is the movie I want to make, but I won't have the resources and the budget to make it a reality until later on. That's definitely the vibe this movie kind of has. It definitely has that kind of like young man's energy to it, even like just the premise of a looper that the movie so carefully and lovingly explains, also much like Inception in the opening minutes. And I think also what the movie does well is that there are other times where it decides not to explain that I think is good. Like, for example, a time the movie shows and doesn't tell is when we see kind of the casual violence of this society, where someone, shoots a thief or a vagrant, as people say, in the street and no one really reacts. But yeah, so I think the movie's good. I think it's got a good script. It's got a good premise. It's executed well. I think that the movie sort of like weirdly like slows way down in the last third. I feel like it doesn't continue to build the tension in the way that I would like it to. I'm not sure specifically what I would change, but I thought that what he did well was explore the themes of kind of free will and regret through these characters and through this premise, free will versus determinism or fate, because is there only one way something can play out, or are there, branching paths? And the movie, I think, wisely kind of acknowledges this issue a few times where they're like, okay, if you think about it too hard, it's just going to break your brain. The movie basically tells you explicitly through the dialogue of the characters, don't try to think about the time travel mechanics too hard. It's all going to fall apart, which is like a cute little coy little nod, a little bit meta. The premise is a vehicle to explore this idea of, do we have free will? Could something have played out differently? Right. And all of the characters in the movie are haunted by some past event that is now irrevocable. Because once something has happened, in a real sense, that's the only way it could have happened. There is no alternate thing you can really imagine, because that is what happened. The circumstances leading up to it in a cause and effect way caused that thing to happen. But at the same time, looking forward to the future, we have to believe in choice. But are we deluding ourselves? And that's kind of the question at the heart of the movie. I've rambled a little bit, but I think it's a cool movie. There's something about it that's kind of holding me back from embracing it wholeheartedly, but I admire what Johnson did with this one, and I think it's holds up pretty well.
All this talk about Johnsons and show and tell. I mean, I haven't heard this much of that kind of language since our episode on the Bling Ring, Tony. So maybe that that restraining order that Emma Watson instated should remain in effect. But let's see. The thing that I'm struck by the most is that you are kind of left feeling somewhat there's a milquetoast energy about it, but there's so much meat on the bone there, right? Like, you were able to talk about what the underpinning is that really propels this movie forward, what the engine is that's pushing it towards its finale. And so let's continue. I would just add one clarification. I think Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character is more propelled by the fact that, like Sid, he felt like he couldn't save his mother. And that ties into the idea of everything looping back at the end, which the end is kind of a little, I would say, convoluted, for lack of a better term. But anyways, let's go to Anthony, and then we'll round out with Connor. Anthony, when was the last time you saw this film? I feel like this is just very relevant because personally, I hadn't seen this film in probably about 5 years, and my opinion of it has just skyrocketed. I love it. I loved it this watch. But Anthony, go ahead.
Sure. So I think the way you referenced it was how many loops have we gone through? It's the third. I remember this movie coming out very distinctly because it was freshman year of college, and the class I was in at Gallatin actually paid for our tickets to go see it. It was like one of the first outings as a college group, for something that wasn't just like the welcome week or anything like that. So I have very fond memories of seeing it with a certain someone whose name we've shared many times. But the second time I saw it, funny enough, is actually the first movie I saw after getting married, because we were craving an action film. And I don't know why we settled on a Looper. It just happened to be on like the Netflix or whatever streaming service is home screen at the time. And I got to say, it's like each time I've watched it, or those first two times I watched it, I wasn't really thrilled, and I wasn't really seeing what the first time, especially back in 2012, what seemed like thunderous applause or kind of a rapture for it. I had seen the Brothers Bloom before that, which was kind of like a Wes Anderson knockoff without any charm. Although Rachel Weisz, I remember giving a very good performance in that movie. But anyway, coming to Looper, each time I've come away with actually something very similar, which is I find the first 30 minutes of the movie the most compelling. I find it like a very interesting kind of cool exercise. I think Paul Dano is completely underused. But I find that part of the world the stuff that intrigues me. And by the time we get to the quote unquote farm, my interest and my kind of curiosity for the film starts to kind of wander away. And I don't know if it ever really pulls me back. So all these kind of deep things that Tony was alluding to, the hauntedness of it, or the hauntedness of these characters, or the kind of the question mark, right, of why Joseph Gordon-Levitt's young character, young Joe, is sort of propelled into motion and propelled to do what he does, isn't really something I find myself asking. Mostly because I think I'm not with the movie at its kind of current wavelength. What I find more fascinating right now is what Tony was bringing up about Rian Johnson feeling like a young man when he wrote it. Because now I'm thinking culturally of like, if he wrote this or was thinking about this in the early 2000s, around the time Nolan was thinking about Inception, they obviously were watching or thinking about The Matrix, Dark City, and all these kind of cool late 90s cyberpunk, cybergothic sort of films and books. And at times it feels like he watched those movies and then thought no one had ever seen 12 Monkeys or no one had ever read Philip K. Dick. And he's the first one to kind of do something with that material. Because what I find overall, I don't know if this will make sense, but what I find personally really frustrating with the movie is that I think there's so many cool potential and so much cool potential and so many cool ideas that run through it that I find that they don't really come to what I would hope they come through. And I feel like it's a kind of a movie of lost potential in ways, of lost ideas or wasted ideas. I almost wish like he handed this off to someone else to do, or like I almost wish someone else took a stab at fleshing out the screenplay even. Because I just find something too big and missing for myself to bring me on the movie's level, or to make me see what maybe Tony saw this rewatch, or to make me get that enthusiasm that you had each time, Kirk. So I don't know. Maybe I'm just bitter because I think we've done a better time travel movie called Tenet. And I'm just kidding. No, I don't know. Like, it's just something's not there, and I'm not seeing it. And maybe something more specific will come out as we talk. But I'll leave it there. I could see the appeal. There are moments of excitement, but as a general, I'm not with the movie's loops. I'm not looped into it. So anyway, I'll be interested to hear what Connor has to say.
Yeah, I mean, Tenet makes this movie look like the first Ice Age animated film. I mean, it's just Tenet is so hard to tackle. But no, I'm curious, let's just stay here for a second. Like, can you kind of, can you flesh that idea out? Like, what is missing? Is there an emotional hook that's absent? Like, do you not feel the I think Emily Blunt's character really has to carry a lot of weight in the second half of the film, and perhaps whether or not you resonate with her intentions and kind of her sincerity, I think that can affect whether or not you really tune in. But anyways, what could you put your finger on, or is it just too hard to do so? I mean, when you talk about wasted potential, what would be the alternative that would excite you or, engage you even further?
I don't know, Kirk. It may be unfair to say I almost wish for a different movie or something, because that's an unfair criticism to throw at anything. Although I could see pieces adding up to like fleshing out the world. I think, maybe this doesn't quite answer what you're asking, Kirk, but I think when it comes to time travel movies or time travel books, for me personally, is I never really care about having to think through the plot or having to think through the mechanics of it. I'm looking for a kind of sense of thematic material to give me an excuse to kind of throw logic aside and have fun with it. In this particular movie, I think Tony brought up the kind of question of free will and the question of, the past versus future, the question of ordained fates, which maybe is a kind of a common reoccurring thing with time travel. The kind of question of what you can change. I think with this movie, I'm kind of intrigued more by the difference and divide of being young and old, of knowing yourself, I suppose, or not knowing yourself, right? I mean, we're trained to think that if like we were to imagine ourselves when we were older, that we'd listen or we'd ask questions and advice. And I think early on in the film, when we get the kind of first encounters and we start to wonder what's going on between old and young, there's a kind of fun tension there that I think kind of dissipates for me as the movie becomes about the farm and those characters kind of start to take hold. Maybe that's something. Maybe I need to sit on it a bit longer.
Interesting. No, I can kind of jive with what you're saying, especially about how, and Tony mentioned it too, how it kind of things slow down very much on the farm. And I almost start feeling like I'm watching Signs or something. It's just, you kind of get tired of that farmland aesthetic. And it is a very sharp contrast to like the cyberpunk, aesthetic, which I like that it's set in Kansas also. That's kind of cool. Like, what city are we seeing? Is this Topeka without Fred Phelps? Is that the future we're envisioning? But
Wichita, I think.
Oh, it's supposed to be Wichita?
I think it's Kansas City, according to Wikipedia. That's where it's.
Okay. Well, then technically it should say Missouri because the real city is in Missouri. But there is a Kansas City, Kansas, but it's a shithole. Anyways, I digress. Last but not least, the person who, preordained this podcast, the person who chose the film and, who bears the weight of Anthony's disappointment. Not me, certainly. No, I'm kidding. Connor, go ahead. What were your thoughts? What loop was this for you? And yeah, take it away wherever you want to go.
So first I'll start by basically repeating exactly what Tony said at the beginning, which is how I watched this movie. I think I watched it in 2012. Probably not in theaters, probably as soon as it came to like Blu-rays. I don't even know. Anyway, I watched it with my brother and my dad. And it's definitely a dad and brother kind of movie. And I don't think I ever watched it again after that. I think to me, like this huge question, I really like this movie. I liked it then and I like it now for pretty much the same reasons of just, for example, to put what Tony said another way, I love how it doesn't explain for the most part. I love the confidence that it has in the audience to understand what's going on, but yet it doesn't really get to like Inception-esque or Tenet-esque, complexity levels. It accepts you to be thrown into this. And what's interesting about it, of course, is not like it's the facts of what's going on, but rather like how the characters are behaving and the interactions between them and what it means to live in this world and the little subtle things that go unremarked upon, that don't need to be explained. As Tony mentioned, like the killing of the guy, the slang that they use, the different kinds of guns, which ends up becoming kind of important. These things is information that's given to us as an audience that is, I think there's something about this movie where there's something kind of matter of fact, kind of blunt, kind of raw, kind of unadorned about it that really gives it like a very unique place, I think, among sci-fi. Like, I think it works and it kind of builds upon something that I think we would see Rian Johnson try to do with The Last Jedi a little bit, I guess, to an extent, or rather this reminds me of Star Wars, this idea of just being thrown into the world and you pick it up as you go along. And we learn about the world through characters interacting and talking about fictional things that aren't real, right? Learning about this context. I think that's like really. I really love how it does. How I love how it realizes this future, which again does feel plausible. I think one reason is because, yeah, sure, it's grimy, it connects to our real world and the trends of our real world, of course. But one thing about it is that it contains, elements of the past, right? Like the future will not see the erasure of, like the past, right? It's like the future, the past will still exist in the future. That's like a hard thing for us to wrap our heads around, but it's very true, right? And I think this movie, it's almost disappointing, right, that it spends so much time on this farm. But of course, there would be farms, and of course, that's no accident that the farm is contrasted with the city, right? I think there's obviously, I can get to that later, but anyway, yeah, I really like this movie. There's nothing, I don't see much flaws with this movie. I love that. Writing wise, I think it's very good. Honestly, I don't see where it's lacking anything. I mean, I think if you consider it like, okay, like the Emily Blunt, like the fact that they have sex, like that part is kind of like makes me roll my eyes. Like, of course they had to have sex. Like, there's the scene where she's like, she just suddenly becomes horny and then she like calls him up, right? That's like a little bit, but the bluntness of that, okay, bluntness, haha, the matter of factness of it, the kind of just that quality of it, I think I like, and it fits with the rest of the movie. But yeah, there's something is wrong with the farm, but I don't know what it is, and I don't know why this movie, didn't have the kind of lasting appeal. I think it was very much respected at the time, but it was sort of a thing to be consumed and then moved on from. Unlike, I would say like Inception or something like that.
Great points. Great points. I think one of the biggest differences for me, and I'll just very quickly kind of sum up my thoughts on the film, but one of the biggest differences is often in movies that seem to take themselves very seriously, like we're always grounded and we're kind of adding our own context to embellish the story, right? And to make the plot feel, we're bringing things in from our own life, and we're thinking about the stakes in a way that might not be presented so as to generate drama and kind of augment the viewing process. Whereas in this film, I found myself like the stakes were so high, the idea is so profound. So there wasn't anything I needed to add. And I found myself not reaching what I felt was kind of the emotional pitch of the film in certain scenarios. Like you kind of have to remind yourself when they're sitting at that table in the diner that these are the same person, right? Like that's kind of just, it's a very radical thing, and it's a creative endeavor to try to conceptualize and to try to put this onto onto the screen, and I commend Ryan for that. And I think he did a good job of really thinking this story through. And like you said, Connor, I think it's well written. Sometimes I don't know if it lives up to its britch. It can kind of fill its britches in the sense of the story is so profound, and yet we're missing something. We're missing that feeling of really being Joseph Gordon-Levitt and seeing our old, our future self. Like maybe it is the disconnect between Bruce Willis and how they look so differently, right? And they try to overcome that with some prosthetics or makeup, whatever it might be, and certainly the contacts, but it doesn't really work to the level you'd want it to. I wonder if they had used, two actors who looked kind of more similar and, but at different ages. And, but I'm saying all this, and I still think it's worthy of induction because I do think it's very novel. I think it's extremely creative. There's so much that you could bite down on here, whether or not you feel compelled to, right? Whether or not the aroma is enticing enough to get you to bite, to get you to savor the food that is presented. But, I do have some kind of issue with the main, the crux of the story. This gifted kid, Sid, who's Emily Blunt's son. He has some sort of telekinetic powers. He's able to initiate a vortex of energy that can kill living organisms. I guess I don't really understand it, but the main issue I have, and I know I'm kind of breaking the rule that Bruce Willis's character sets forth, and I'm trying to connect the straws on the table, but I don't understand how the Rainmaker, if the Rainmaker is somebody who was created by this whole confrontation with Bruce Willis, right? So then in that timeline, Bruce Willis hasn't gone, he hasn't survived yet. Like, we see the very beginning of his timeline where he kills his future self. He goes on and lives in Shanghai. And then there's this Rainmaker. So why does this person exist already? When we're clearly being told that, these things aren't set forth, like they do have agency. He can write a name on his arm and it can show up in the future, right? Like, he can create new memories. So I just don't, that's one thing I really don't understand. If anybody wants to jump in and help clarify that, but otherwise I think it is immaterial. It really doesn't, it doesn't lead to anything. But it's something to think about. Like, you run the risk of alienating your audience when they can't really understand what you're trying to do. And for me, this was very evident in my first viewing when Joseph Gordon-Levitt slips off the fire escape, and essentially that reality, or that, that timeline ends, or does it? I'm not sure. I guess when I was watching it, I spent the next 20 minutes trying to understand what I had just seen. Like, why was he now back in the field? Why was he now about to kill his, future self again? I think what Ryan's trying to do is he's trying to point out that it's a paradox, and that timeline can't happen, I guess, if Joseph Gordon-Levitt dies in that instance. But maybe I'm wrong. Did anybody have any reading? Because that's like the boldest kind of directorial choice, in my opinion, of the whole film, is how we're supposed to understand what exactly is going on in that moment where he slips, he falls onto the street, and then the very next second he's back in the cornfield. Does anybody have any thoughts on that segue? Like, what is that? Is it a paradox that we're seeing, and that's kind of him teaching us that, these adventures have to play out by certain rules? Anybody want to jump in? Like, how did you understand that? Whether or not you're right, whether or not you're correct.
I don't know. I have no idea. I don't even actually remember it. So yeah, he falls up, and then, like, but isn't he like taken to the field? I don't know. Like, I just don't remember.
Yeah,
honestly,
I didn't think he died. Like, yeah, that now I'm thinking about it more, and like, yeah, I'm a little confused. It's not communicated very clearly, but I was just kind of swept up in, okay, we're seeing Bruce Willis's backstory. But I thought, yeah, at that point he had been like taken by his bosses, and it was basically like a blackout. Like, he gets knocked out, and then we see what happened with Bruce Willis.
I don't know, because prior to that, he had fucked up killing Bruce Willis. And then remember, he went back to his apartment, and there was a shootout with the young Blue, or whatever his name is, and he fell. And then he was back in the field, and Bruce Willis appeared and he killed him. And then he went on to live his life the whole 30 years. So, like, that was the beginning of the actual timeline, I guess. But Anthony, do you have any thoughts?
No, I was similarly confused. I actually had your kind of reading, Kirk. The only thing I could use to plausibly explain it is like this is like a multiple timeline sort of like world, and that I guess we're watching a movie with like a particular set of times with these characters, where like there's another kind of venture out there happening, or potentially happening, which is always the trouble with any time travel movie. I mean, the movie likes to lean into the paradox, I guess, but you're right.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a kind of confusion here, because I thought he had died.
Right. Yeah. And then in the next timeline, he falls on a car, which I think saves him, and then Bruce Willis pulls him off the car. But no, I just quickly back on my thoughts. I think what you said, Anthony, I think he could have stretched the dough a little bit in certain places. One scene, or I guess a series of events that I enjoyed was the montage where he's, it says year 1, year 6. I thought that was so cool. I don't know why. Maybe it was because it took place in, Shanghai, like this, futuristic Shanghai, which already it's, that city has such a contrast between new and old. But I thought that was great. And that's what I'm saying. Like there's so many moments in this film where you could really kind of, turn up the emotional resonance. And it feels like he holds back for the sake of the plot at times. And the one thing that he does turn up is this relationship between Emily Blunt and her son, and correspondingly the relationship between Joseph Gordon-Levitt and his mother. We get some dialogue, some scenes devoted to her talking about coming back to see Sid, and Joseph Gordon-Levitt talking about when he ran away from his mother, or I forget how he got separated. But so what does that mean? I'll throw it to anybody. Like, what is Rian Johnson trying to do aside from, the idea that we've established that, that is very typical for time travel films about, fate versus, agency. In this instance, he seems to lean very heavily into this mother-son dyad, this idea of having a nurturing caregiver, and that can, it's almost I don't know, it veers into the kind of certain areas. It's quite moralizing in a sense, talking about the importance of this sort of structure, these structured units for the overall health of society. And I'm wondering if anybody else was impressed in that way. Like, did they feel that he was trying to touch on something, and did it land, or did you not really sense the relevance with the whole, mother son trying to protect, trying to go, I'm just curious if anybody had any thoughts on that aspect of it, because it does come back at the end. And it's kind of the crux of the film, where Sid is saved, and then consequently, because he is saved, he's not subjected to this separation. He's able to live a life that isn't so evil, I guess.
I mean, I feel like this is the basic material he has to work with. These are very tropey, kind of things. And ultimately, I think if you're analyzing it, as you are, Kirk, if you really do stop and think about it, there's something very almost reactionary about this movie, that it's about, it's about this kind of, the wastoid, or it's just so, kind of conservative. I mean, as so many movies really are in terms of their values, right? This individual who's gone astray, who's wasting his life, who's, a hedonist, right? And then he learns the power of self-sacrifice for the sake of the family unit, right? Which is sacred and is everything. And the fact that, we have the contrast of the two families that are trying to be saved, ultimately, we really have to sacrifice ourselves for the family, with a child on a farm in middle America, as opposed to the non-child having household in China, right? I mean, that's also kind of on a farm. They're supposed to be kind of parallel. But yeah, I think this is kind of the basic stuff he has to work with. However, and I think there's definitely a feminist demolishing of the Emily Blunt character, and how she's kind of both mother and wife, and all these things. But I think obviously, yes, I mean, what's going on here is, we have not the dyad, but the triad. It's the kind of boy, young man, old man. And, I think there is some kind of metaphorical resonance to the relationship of those three figures, right? And it's kind of about, the trauma of the boy, the sort of the straying and the wandering of the young man. But ultimately he's the one with the most kind of purpose, ultimately. And then the old man, who is a kind of an obstacle to the young man, but also, right, is kind of parallel to the boy, in that they're both trying to protect the people they love, right? The young man does not have someone to love, really. I mean, he kind of does, but he anyway, there is some kind of Fox News values to this movie as well. Or Tucker Carlson might have a cool reading of the movie. But yeah.
Yeah, I guess it is. It is a pretty played trope. Was somebody else going to jump in? I didn't see.
I wanted to jump in on the triad and the three phases. I like that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Of the boy, the young man, and the old man, right? It's a kind of a Chewy angle from the movie. But if we're looking at the movie through this lens, what are we to make of Bruce Willis's character then? And like, because he's Joseph Gordon-Levitt, the young man who's he's an addict, doesn't have anyone to live for. He's just this isolated, lonely man. Like Connor said, he's a hedonist, living for the pleasures of the moment. And Bruce Willis, the older man who's been, has a committed relationship, and has found this grounding and maturity in it, despises this about his younger self and is like, I was such a fool back then. But Bruce Willis's character is like, kind of the villain of the movie. I mean, he's like really like, I don't think we're supposed to think, and I'm not saying you're saying this, but I'm just wondering how this fits in with the reading, where the man who is the older man, the wiser man, in quotes, the man who's tied down, is also doing the most kind of morally depraved things of the movie. Like he kills a child. He's attacking the family structure. He's destroying it. He's reaping, violence and feeding into that cycle of kind of vengeance. So, and I'm not saying that makes it incoherent. I'm just curious, how does that all tie together? How do you read that?
It's a good question. I don't know, Connor, if you want to jump in, or Anthony. I think, we're meant to see Bruce Willis as selfish, right? I think even though Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character is immature, certainly, and is misguided, he does make a point when he says, "You had your turn, right? This is my turn," and I think that's very true. At least that seems fair, right? That seems fair, like a fair assessment. And so to me, I do agree that we're meant to see Bruce Willis as somebody who's acting irrationally, to, not really somebody who's acting within the best interests of his former self or the people with whom he interacts. I think conversely, we're very much meant to feel that Joseph Gordon-Levitt has, though he's brash, he's able to grow during his time on the farm. I don't know what that's necessarily about. It's probably tied to the fact that he sees Emily Blunt's character as a motherly figure. He sees the love that she has for her son. She strokes his hair after he's dead at the end, which is a great tie back to when he's with the sex worker, and he asks her to stroke his hair, because that's the last memory he has of his mother, or what she used to do for him. So yeah, I think we're meant to go on the ride with Joseph Gordon-Levitt and to see kind of Bruce Willis as a hindrance, but also to empathize with him very much, because we do see his wife being killed, and that's a very, very sad moment as well. But it's ultimately up to everybody's own discretion as to whether or not they enjoy the ride that he's created. And I think it certainly is a ride, and there's a lot of food for thought here. This isn't a movie that's just kind of got a one note. It's got multiple angles, multiple perspectives. It's thoroughly convoluted, like I said, which can sometimes work to its advantage. I'm curious, looking more mechanically at some of the decisions that Rian Johnson made. We see some moments where, and this ties back into the telekinesis aspect, but we see some moments where, time travel isn't the only kind of relative impossibility. We see these, people's bodies kind of exploding in midair due to a child's scream. And we see, at the end, they're in the cane fields, and all this debris is circling a floating Bruce Willis and a floating Emily Blunt. I'm curious, are those too jarring based on kind of it felt like a gritty world that he was trying to set forth in the beginning of the film. And then, as we go on, things become more and more fantastical. And I guess any thoughts just mechanically on that, or also do you understand the purpose of Sid having these superpowers? Do you even understand what it does for the movie thematically, or perhaps is it meant to draw interest in the latter half of the film where maybe he felt there wasn't enough? I'm just, why does Sid have to have superpowers to begin with? So kind of processing out loud here. But Anthony, I'll throw this to you.
Yeah, honestly, I've never understood Sid's superpowers beyond them being kind of interesting. And I guess in a way, because he has them, we're supposed to buy the idea that he could become the Rainmaker. Like that's the whole thing. Like if we're to believe everything, but this goes back to like a kind of previous point, Kirk, or maybe a kind of overthinking or a wrongful way of thinking about this, which is I've always had a funny thing with this movie in which I actually, to me, Bruce Willis is old Joe's in a way the kind of hero of the film. It's in his way, his coming to the farm, inspiring the kind of violence that then kicks Emily Blunt's character into gear because of her talking with young Joe. Her whole instinct to becoming a mother in the first place has to rely on a fear and protection of the child, one that's only possible because of a threat of this older guy, if I have it right. My big point, though, with all this is what's to really stop Sid from being the Rainmaker? The thing we have to believe in is old Joe's claim that there are many possible futures and that we still have to stick with one if we could set the right present into the timeline. It's what he kind of gets at in the diner, if I have that right. So when I call him a kind of hero, I'm being kind of, like tongue in cheek a bit, but in a way, like he's kind of the necessary element here. But it does make me wonder more and more, like how the film will play without Sid's superpowers, why they're necessary, and why the Rainmaker as a kind of idea has to be so foreordained for young Joe to kind of have to stop it in place. Maybe I'm just asking the wrong questions now.
No, I think it's a good question. Any responses, Connor or Tony, to the character in general or anything else?
Okay, it's always been kind of weird that he's like a crime boss, but he also like controls the world. And like, if like, how did they not know he has these powers? Isn't he going around like, blasting people and blowing people up with his mind and stuff? Like, it's kind of weird. It's kind of like unclear. Like, it doesn't really quite make sense, like what's happening in the future. But okay, whatever. But okay, why does he have superpowers? There's two things I really like about this. One is this idea of, you mentioned this thing. Oh yeah, and by the way, in the future, some people can do telekinesis, and you're like, what? Like, okay, this has got to come in somehow. But it's like, no, it keeps on coming up, and it's like it's just like a parlor trick. It's this totally innocuous thing, and then suddenly, boom! This thing that seemed innocuous is like affecting the entire world. And I think that's like kind of true, of some things we've seen in our lifetimes, right? I'm thinking of like internet, AI, global warming, things that just at first time, start out as a little novelty and then they become, epic making, events, right? And I think there's kind of like a truth to that I like. And the other thing is that I think the movie really like it's the cinematic treatment of Sid is unique, and Sid's pain is given a special, it's treated in slow motion. It's treated as kind of it's given a lot of time and presence and on the screen of Sid just freaking out. And I think that's, meant to say something about like, again, like maybe this is what's at the heart of the problems of the two other characters who, right, fundamentally their issues too are this issue of having no one to love, right, or of wanting to be nurtured. In the case of Bruce Willis's character, right, it's that he wants to have his wife, who would be his nurturer figure, but now is ripped away from her. They've all had the same experience of losing their mother, right? All of these characters have, right? Of their losing their nurturer, and they don't want to lose her again, right? So, there's like a through line there where like Sid's freak out moments, which by the way is ripped off of like I think it's kind of ripped off of like a Twilight Zone episode, not the blowing up, not the making people explode, but that kind of idea is like based in this idea of like the tumult, the tumultuousness of those childhood emotions that I think like still affect us right into our adulthood according to psychology, right?
Yeah, good point. And I always found it weird that Bruce Willis's character, he's like, she's gonna save you. That kind of rubbed me the wrong way, and it shows that he didn't necessarily like. I guess it kind of explains some of his actions because he's very dependent upon his wife. She's this pivotal figure in his life, and she almost she saves you. Like, isn't that something you want to work on yourself? So anyways, I kind of view Bruce Willis's character with some pity. But Tony, any thoughts on the character Sid, some of the effects that were used, anything around this telekinesis, wherever you want to take it.
Yeah, I like Connor's kind of reading of it. I think that makes sense to me, and I think that can be justified on a thematic level. However, I mean, it just feels, when you watch the movie, it just feels really weird. And like, at first blush, you see the parlor trick scenes early on where it introduces this idea of telekinesis, and it's like, whatever, it's a sci-fi movie I can buy. I thought it was just kind of coloring in the world, but it just felt like so like irrelevant to the time travel conceit. It's like such a different concept. I'm almost like, wait, let's have the telekinesis movie and then we'll have Looper. Like, let's have another movie about that world where that's a thing, right? And then when Sid shows up, to me, it almost feels like that was the most half-assed way of, like, it's almost like they wrote it without the telekinesis at the beginning, and they're like, this can't come out of nowhere. We have to show people doing it, so it didn't come out of absolute nowhere, so it feels a little off. I understand Connor's point. I can kind of vibe with it on that level. To me, like, the purpose it serves in terms of our emotional, how we engage with the story and the motivations of the various characters is like it's easy to imagine a version of this movie where that just element is just eliminated, in terms of, like, he has to go back and kill a mob boss who kills his wife. It's very easy to imagine that. The telekinesis element, I think, makes it more like Sid is a threat. Sid is a dangerous threat. Sid is a dangerous child. We are more, I guess, conflicted than we'd otherwise be. Seeing Bruce Willis kill the kid without telekinesis, even if we know he grows up to be a mob boss, is a little less palatable than killing the kid who has these powers that he can't control and that he will use to kill other people, right? It makes it a little bit more morally complex, I suppose. Although I think the movie frames it as being, bad, something to not do. So I think on that level, it's a little bit contrived, I guess. It's a little bit like a little easy from a screenwriting standpoint. How do we make this kid a threat? We just give him superpowers. I feel like there were more elegant ways to do that, but I think it mostly works. I don't know. I'm very ambivalent about it. In a way, I like the chutzpah of that move, and the way the movie can make that big turn in its second half. But at the same time, it does feel like a bit of a turn away from that grounded cyberpunk world that I kind of bought into in the first half hour of the movie. But what I think is, if I may transition slightly here, I think what I'm sort of, something bothers me about the end of this movie as I think about it more, because, and like, as much as I want to avoid getting into the time travel mechanics, I think that, like, with this movie, they keep cropping up in annoying ways that I think interfere with, like, the thematics of the movie. And mainly what I'm talking about is the very end, where Joseph Gordon-Levitt kills himself, which is framed as this heroic moment of self-sacrifice to save the kid and end the cycle of violence once and for all. Which, first of all, he doesn't know that that's what's going to happen, right? But also, like, in a very literal sense, what he is doing is he realizes that he has such violence in him. He realizes he's going to rot so much destruction that the best thing he can do for the world is just to kill himself, which is kind of a horrifying idea, which I don't think that's what Rian Johnson intended, the message he intended to convey with the movie. But with this premise, like, that's the unavoidable kind of conclusion, right? There's no other, it's saying that there are some people that are just so bad, they just need to kill themselves to prevent the harm that they will do in the future. Because in theory, could Joseph Gordon-Levitt just watch what's happened and say, well, I just won't do that then. When I become Bruce Willis, I just won't kill the kid. But it's like, but it already happened. So it's just, that's what I mean when I say that the time travel stuff kind of gets in the way of the thematics of the movie. Because to me, I would prefer the ending where he just makes the decision to choose another path, choose a better path, rather than end his life. But it's just confused for me.
Let me jump on real quick, because I actually had a very similar thought to you, Tony. But a final thing about this is, we're supposed to assume this whole time that the Rainmaker is this horrible kind of villain that we only kind of really see as a child. He's this ruthless mob boss who's so powerful. The only way to stop him is to try to figure out a way to go back in time, figure out his identity, and kill him before he becomes who he is, which already erases a whole set of the people who have to do this or want to do it. Is there a way of thinking about this movie, though, Tony, where young and old Joe are the only people who really do know the Rainmaker's identity? The Rainmaker has set a number of this into motion to stop the only people that are capable of stopping him. And there's a second question here, too, which is, does Sid still grow up to be the Rainmaker who sets then this whole film into motion if we're to believe the young Joe's idea that early idea that the past, present, and future are still kind of immobile? Or there's another version here too, which is the Rainmaker actually wants to stop himself from becoming who he is as the villain and wants to be the kind of guy who still has his mom at the end of the day, which corresponds to Connor's earlier idea of the Fox News values. Either way, the villains of the movie are Joe, if we think about it from that angle. And that solves much of our time travel paradoxes. Doesn't explain the telepathy at all, but it helps explain some of these difficulties.
Does it explain the sensual moment where she's rubbing her thigh, and then the very, very, I have to say, expertly smoked post-sex cigarette? Just perfect, Emily Blunt.
It's all a mother fantasy.
I don't know. I was just trying to deflect from the fact that it's completely untouchable in a sense. I mean, Anthony, I caught some of the words you were saying. I thought you might have been speaking
I was lost as well, I have to say, Anthony.
But I think one thing I thought where you're like, he's sending it back to change his path. The Rainmaker is sending it back to change his path so that he doesn't want to be evil, essentially.
That's one potential reading. The other, okay, so there's two potential ideas if we're thinking about this movie. Is the Rainmaker so powerful in this future world, right? It's set in the early parts. The only way to stop him is to time travel back and take him out before he becomes the Rainmaker. But the Rainmaker's so powerful, what I'm suggesting is he actually is putting the plot of the movie we see into motion. There's one angle of reading about this, which is he doesn't want to be the evil villain he is. So he sends Joe on a mission to save his mother, or to save a kind of relationship with Emily Blunt's character and Sid, right? The other side of viewing it is the Rainmaker is still going to be there, even though young Joe kills himself. But in setting old Joe and young Joe on the track for each other, he's taking out the only two people who could stop him.
Yeah, either way, it's just like a snake eating his tail, because who was the first Joe to kill the future Joe, and like, what did that future Joe do? And it never makes, like, it's just an infinite loop in my understanding. And maybe they should have named the movie Looper or something. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, let's wind down. Very, very fascinating film. I think we have gotten more into the weeds with the plot of the film on this podcast than maybe ever. And it speaks to the creativity, right? The chutzpah, the willingness to put 30 million into a film that can be so convoluted. I mean, even films like Interstellar, they feel like they have kind of like an emotional some emotional bumper pads, whereas this film just it's really jarring at times, and especially at the end, the aesthetic, the image of him killing himself with the blunderbuss. I mean, it doesn't suffer an audience that's inattentive or perhaps just looking for a fun ride. But and that might be to its detriment, as we'll find out in the voting here. I'm not really even sure that there's not really a safe vote. So I guess I'll get I don't even know what order to go in. Anthony, go ahead.
Yeah, I liked the ideas Connor and Tony presented. I mean, maybe my reading didn't make sense, but it is making me rethink my own opinion of the film. I'm kind of a maybe. I feel like if I had gone second, I may have given it a soft yes now, but I'm going to say a soft no.
Okay. Yeah, I see. It's just there's nowhere safe to return, but I will give the power to end this right now to Connor, who chose the film to begin with. So you can end it or you can extend it to Tony. Go ahead, Connor.
Well, Kirk, I stand by what I said at the very beginning that there's something missing. And I think what you're saying is that the something that's missing is a willingness to meet the audience where it is, perhaps more. I'm not sure if that's it. I love this movie for its kind of ugly, again, matter of factness is the term I want to use. It's not gruesome. It's not, it doesn't revel in violence exactly, but it just the violence happens in front of you and it shocks you, and but it just doesn't comment on it. Just lets it kind of hang there. There's something very powerful about that. I think it's a unique kind of aesthetic like achievement that he had in this movie. And yeah, so even though there's that something is missing, there's that emptiness at the center of it, maybe that's because we were all loopers all along. It's a yes.
All right. Yeah, I was, one shot I forgot is Bruce Willis dual wielding P90s as he mows down a bunch of Gat boys. I mean,
That
come on.
part feels like kind of like weird, like the fan service.
Yeah, it totally is. It's like a Wolfenstein level, but whatever. I mean, we'll take it. We'll take small victories. All right, Tony, you've been imbued with a lot of power here. Let's hear what your verdict is.
Yeah, so everyone's alluded to kind of there being something missing, and I felt that way myself. I think for me, that thing might be as simple as just more shared screen time for Joseph Gordon-Levitt and Bruce Willis. I mean, that first scene in the diner, I think is kind of the montage of Joseph Gordon-Levitt Pokemon evolving into Bruce Willis. That's the highlight of the movie. That's the coolest sequence. But my favorite scene of characters interacting is that scene in the diner. It's such a cool premise. The past you and the future you talking. I think it's such a universally relatable concept, and it's such a cool way to use the time travel concept. And just like Bruce Willis talking to Joseph Gordon-Levitt with this almost disgust, because he's talking to himself, but it's the version of himself he left behind. That's great. That's so good. And I feel like it feels like such a missed opportunity to me that they spend the entire movie apart. Joseph Gordon-Levitt sits on a farm, and then Bruce Willis goes off, murdering children, which I give the movie props for going there. And then the scene we just discussed with him mowing down the gangsters, I think it cheapens the movie, frankly. I mean, I think that it would be better if we just get your badass Bruce Willis. He plays a badass assassin. Yeah, he kills 11-year-olds in this movie. Sorry, that's all you're getting. That is the more uncompromising, I think, commitment to this bleak future that I kind of would have liked to see. But then I think, again, the ending, I think, is thematically incoherent, because it simultaneously says that we can't use violence to right the wrongs of the world. We have to have faith that this child will, it's kind of weird. It's like has its cake and eats it too, because killing the child is taken off the table, basically, because Bruce Willis fails to do so. But the movie seems to be saying it's better to let him live. It's better to have faith that he will have the choice to not be the Rainmaker, or that he will, by virtue of his relationship with his mother, he will be able to have a better future. But for Joseph Gordon-Levitt, that is not an option, apparently. He needs to die. So I just think it's a little bit thematically confused. I think the movie is a little bit cute by trying to avoid these difficult questions about the time travel mechanics. I also think there's some things that just aren't communicated very clearly. Like when one of Abe's men comes to the farm, does he know that the Rainmaker's there? I guess not. I guess under Anthony's reading, he does. It's just a weird, why does he have to hide? It's just, I don't know. It's just a weird, I don't know. There's too many things to me that don't quite come together, that don't quite connect, that don't quite click for me with this movie, even though I think a lot of the ingredients are really cool. So I am a no on Looper, unfortunately.
All right, folks. I think the issue we had here is Tony had a conversation with his future self about his understanding of his, how he felt about Looper, and that clouded his judgment, and he fell into the trap. The idea that he premeditated his future without considering his agency to vote yes, and that's the issue we've found ourselves in. So yes, Looper is a no, I guess, and that's okay. Not everything belongs in our canon. I will say it's an interesting film, one that maybe in 10 years I'll watch again, and I'll probably have a different take on it. It's not, there's always something more to explore in this film. But anyways, thank you all for your very kind-hearted, I shall say, opinions and considerate approach. And now we'll move on to our final segment where I decide the next film that we will be watching. I do not know who went least recently, but whoever went least recently gets to decide the order for nominations. It's either Anthony or Tony. I think it might be Anthony. Have you been on a very long cold streak, Anthony?
Yeah, I think I have. I don't even remember the last movie I've done. But,
yeah,
it's Fright Night.
It was Fright Night. Fright Night, scared everyone away from picking my movies.
There you go. Anthony, you're gonna go a whole holidays, a whole calendar year. The next movie that's gonna be chosen is Scream 4 by you. So go. What's the order, Anthony?
Well, first of all, it's the underrated film in the Scream franchise, but I'll go second. I'll let Tony go first and Connor last.
All right, Tony, and our decade rule is in effect. If you choose whatever decade your film is from, nobody else can claim a nomination from that decade.
So I recently saw a movie that I was really taken with. I talked to Connor about it at length. But I'm not going to pitch that movie. I'm going to pitch another movie by the same director. So the director I'm referring to is S. Craig Zahler. And the movie I watched recently by him that I loved was Dragged Across Concrete. But another movie of his that I loved, that I am dying to do on the pod, I've wanted to do for a long time, is his previous film from 2017, Brawl in Cell Block 99, starring Vince Vaughn in one of his early kind of attempts at like a serious, more kind of gritty role. And S. Craig Zahler occupies this kind of really interesting place in our contemporary landscape. He makes these extremely long, ultra violent films that really revel in like silence and really revel in stillness, but also like really indulge in this kind of Tarantino-esque noir dialogue. But his movies tend to be very like un-PC. He doesn't have like an official like political stance, but he has kind of a reputation as a bit of a conservative. His movies are a bit kind of problematic, particularly like his latest was very criticized for its depiction of police brutality, and it has these characters kind of espousing these, very reactionary views that aren't really countered or, critiqued by the movie sufficiently for some people's taste. But I find what I like about his movies is sort of this like kind of bracing quality of sort of like, it doesn't feel the need to distance itself from the horrible things we're seeing. It has to let us just sit in it. So Brawl in Cell Block 99, Vince Vaughn's the main character, and basically he's an ex-con, a former felon whose wife is kidnapped by some gangsters. She is pregnant, and there's this evil abortionist who's going to perform an abortion on her against her will, unless he goes into this highly secure prison and kills a guy. This is our setup for the plot. It is an incredibly dirty looking, uncomfortable, brutally violent movie that is absolutely transfixing, and I think it's ripe for discussion. Like there's a lot of angles you can kind of take it, and I think that Zahler is such an interesting, like one of a kind kind of contemporary voice in our like kind of cinematic landscape. And I think it'll be fascinating to discuss the movie in the context of sort of like, American politics,
what we want out of art and politics and all sorts of things. So that was way too long for a first introduction. I kind of blew my load there, but that's my pitch.
It's okay, Tony. It's okay. Happens to all of us. Happens to the best of us. It's been a while. Wink, wink. Anyways, Anthony, go ahead.
Well, I don't know if I could follow Tony's rapturous introduction for that film. Sounds so intriguing. I'm going to do something too, I guess, then that kind of plays on the sort of noir crime element, if I heard that right. And I recommended this movie to Tony a couple times. I don't know if he's seen it because he's seen practically everything, but I don't know if he's seen it since I recommended it. It's Paul Schrader's American Gigolo from 1980. And it's a personal choice because I've always found it much more exciting, much more interesting than the typical kind of taxi drivers that people tend to follow or favor. We've done a Paul Schrader movie before, but what makes American Gigolo so interesting, so exciting is it follows Richard Gere in probably his most beautiful, most handsome court of age, who plays a kind of male prostitute, a male escort, who's kind of tasked to kind of work for a kind of older couple when one of the husband of this couple ends up murdered, and he kind of becomes implicated in the crime. And what the movie becomes is sort of an interesting sense of coolness about LA, a dissection of kind of an in-between late 70s, early 80s Americana. It's a movie about style without having a kind of clear-cut style itself other than being detached. But what it does in the way it kind of frames him, in the way it kind of frames the overall use of the story, is something I think that's kind of endlessly dissectable for us. And I think the thing that is interesting to me is I've told Tony this before, and I know he disagrees, is I've always found Paul Schrader movies just boring. And I've never found the boredom of use. This is a movie I think that actually is exciting and engaging. Not because it does the typical things Paul Schrader does, but because he actually lets himself go loose as both director and writer of the film. And so anyway, American Gigolo 1980. I'll let Connor go.
All right. Thank you, Anthony. Connor, go ahead.
Well, Tony took my decade, my original pick, so it's time to go back in time. We're talking about noir. Why don't we just watch an actual noir film? You know, where it all comes from. How about 1946, The Postman Always Rings Twice, starring Lana Turner, based on a novel by James M. Cain, who also wrote the novel which Double Indemnity is based on. I would put it up there with Double Indemnity as one of the greatest noir films. Of course, you know, depends on how you define noir. Okay, it's in black and white. It's moody. Like Double Indemnity, it's about kind of normal people, not hard, you know, like hard-boiled criminals or anything like that. Obviously based in this, you know, genre of crime fiction. I don't know really how to describe it to you, Kirk. You know, to me, what I took away from my last watch of it was that it portrays desire in a way that is more truly thrilling and understandable and intuitable than anything I've seen, you know, in a modern movie. I think there's something about this time, about the nature of, you know, the erotic, as it could be portrayed, obviously in this rather staid, you know, post-code, post-Hays Code period, that produces obviously this restraint that is captivating. And of course, there's many other things. It's a wonderfully written, very cleverly written story, and of course these actors will captivate you. Of course it's going to be a little bit, you know, sort of, obviously it's of its time, you know, but I think if you want to take a look at the past, I think it would reward your journey.
Okay. So this is, you know, there have certainly been times where I've wanted to watch none of the movies presented, but I would watch all three of these films. They all sound very good, at least the way you're presenting them. So now we have an option. We have the opportunity for some, you know, rebuttals. Perhaps if you've seen the other films, you might want to start trashing them, or say you watched that film yesterday and you don't want to watch it again, or your dog ate your homework, whatever it is. So who started? Tony, go ahead.
Thanks, Kirk. I have seen The Postman Always Rings twice. I'm afraid to say I don't remember it too well. Sorry, Connor. The only thing I desired during that movie was to turn it off. No, I don't know. I've not seen American Gigolo, but I want to see it. Paul Schrader is definitely one of my guys, one of my faves, as I've discussed in the Mishima episode. So I would watch either of these movies. I guess I've probably talked about mine at length. I guess just in terms of, if you want a classic Tony experience, if you want something visceral, if you want something intense, if you want something that feels like almost out of time, like it feels like it was made in an earlier time, but also couldn't have been made until it came out. It's just a very singular kind of experience and vibe, and just the combination of kind of the ultra violence and also just the slow pace. There's something very intoxicating about it that I think you would vibe with. So that would be my pitch. I can't say that it's better than the other ones, but that's why I like it.
Interesting. Okay, it's an erotic camping experience because, let's face it, it's fucking intense. Anthony, go ahead.
All right. I gotta say, is Connor's pick is really cool. You know, it's a great movie. Postman Always Rings Twice. James Cain, one of the great writers of the 20th century, also wrote one of the most underrated noirs and books, Mildred Pierce. Excellent film, but Postman Always Rings Twice is really cool. John Garfield gives a great performance in that movie, and Lana Turner is absolutely amazing. It is the movie that got Frank Sinatra interested in womanizing, and I say that quite literally. He saw this movie and realized he could not be faithful to his wife. He was so in love with Lana Turner, which is a fascinating fact. I'm not familiar with Tony's film or director. I've heard of Bone Tomahawk, but I really don't know too much. I suppose I'm kind of curious in a kind of conservative filmmaking, even if it's not labeled as that. We've had a little touch of it with the guy who did Battleship, I suppose, and Connor's reading of that film and the kind of Armand White experience. But yeah, so it kind of sounds intriguing. If we're kind of in the mood, I guess, or as Tony said, a visceral, heart-pounding, politically incorrect experience, maybe that's the way to go. I have nothing more to say on it. American Gigolo, I will say, it's like LA in the 1980s, Kirk. You're going to love trying to pinpoint things down in your brief but limited time of knowing Southern California and of what you love about maps, city skylines, and whatnot. It does offer a very kind of interesting subtext in terms of, you know, thinking about the city and thinking about the way it influences people's lives. I think on another level, it's just something else we haven't done much, is without being direct about it, it is a film that is just like very upfront and very interested in trying to present a kind of homosexuality on film and a homosexuality of viewership of the gays in a way that's just so fascinating, so different from what we've watched before. That may be worth talking about. I don't know. Richard Gere at that age, as I said, is just one of the most handsome people that's ever been on film. I'll put it there. And it offers it through the lens of a truly exciting kind of plot that I hope is captivating. I don't know.
You said Gaze, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
I was like, that is an anachronism, what you just said, but then I realized you said gaze. Like, okay. Connor, please go ahead, finish this off before we fall off a cliff here.
Thanks, Kirk. I have not seen the other two. Both sound very fascinating. I have to say, with Zoller, I don't like his movies very much. From what I've only seen Drive Across Concrete, actually, so I shouldn't say. But I have a feeling I find it very off-putting. I find it very like viscerally stomach-turning. Not only because of the things that he depicts, but I realize I'm only making it seem cooler. And now I kind of think if I believe that, I kind of have to watch it now. Like I don't want to chicken out. So like, yeah, there's that in its favor. And Tony intrigued me with his kind of chin stroking, kind of like sort of promises of analysis. But I'm sure I'm getting a lot of that with Anthony's as well, which I don't know much about. But I think Schrader is kind of a theme. We can bring what we know of him to our discussion. But I think again, just if you want the pure cinematic experience of a classic noir film, I think Kirk, you would really enjoy it, and I think it would just be it's always good to revisit the classics on the podcast. I think we've been kind of staying in mostly in this century, but I think it might be nice to look a little bit further back too.
All right, well said, well presented to everybody. I'm intrigued. You've sold your movies well. Unfortunately, I do have to choose one and not all three. So, with that being said, I have thought a lot about what gaps we do have in our episodes and in our canon. And I have to give Anthony a lot of credit because he has nominated quite a few films from the 70s, late 60s, and early 80s, kind of like that 15-year gap post Summer of Love that we don't really pay much attention to. We kind of overlook, I think, except for a few choice films. So I guess I'm drawn to American Gigolo. It is a film I've heard of and one that I've been interested in seeing because my first exposure to Richard Gere was through some silly rom-com, I'm sure, and then I saw Pretty Women. And I'm curious about how these types of actors that you have a very firm conceptualization of, like, how do they get their acting chops, and kind of the spatial element of it, the spatial geometry of an LA that's kind of grappling with the excesses of the decade and the era, and turning towards the future and wondering what the future is going to look like. I'm very curious. So, I could say great things about the other two and what draw me to them, but I will say that in a blind test, not even because it's been a little bit of a dry spell, I'm most drawn to American Gigolo. I think we need these films with kind of interpersonal entanglements a little bit more, and the era we're lacking a little bit. And selfishly, I want to go back to LA. I just watched The Verdict, so now I'm jumping in a plane. I'm flying from Logan to LAX because we're staying in the early 80s. So let's go to LA, and Anthony, take us away.
Well, I feel like that was a little bit of pity in there, and I slipped Kirk 100 really, on the outside. So
it really wasn't. I'm trying to fill in our canon in the best way possible, and to be honest, yeah, I like, if you were to put a movie on right now, I'd probably watch the Vince Vaughn Wedding Crashers Gone Viral or whatever it's called, but that's just because I like the immediacy of it, but I am intrigued by your film. So Anthony, what do you have to say for us?
Very cool. And I'll have what she's having.